Bonjour, bienvenue. Je m'appelle Rafiko Ruiz et je suis le directeur associé de la recherche au CCA. Welcome to the third Architecture's Public Concern Lecture. This is an annual event that anchors the CCA Research Network, an entity that brings together the over 700 fellows who've undertaken research at and with the CCA since its founding in 1979. I'd like to begin by recognizing the longstanding connections of Indigenous peoples to Tiohtià:ke, Muniang, Montreal, in particular the Kanagahaga people of Ganawage, Ganasatake, and Akwesasne, whose ancestors, along with those of Wendat, Anishinaabe, and Abenaki communities, lived here long before the arrival of settlers. Still today, the island is home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. These communities continue to face challenges to their rights and the erosion of their traditional territories as a result of ongoing processes of settler colonialism. The CCA itself puts on exhibitions and events, maintains its collections, and publishes texts on these lands that have not been ceded by their Indigenous inhabitants. The CCA therefore recognizes its settler colonial roots, and we are committed to fostering affirmative relationships with Indigenous peoples across Tiohtià:ke, Muniang, Montreal. We invite you to learn more about the CCA's ongoing commitment to our Living Land Acknowledgement process by visiting our website and specifically clicking on the Living Land Acknowledgement tab. If you happen to be in Montreal and can visit the CCA, you can get to know better our current project called Everlasting by the artist and researcher Amanda Lickers that looks at urban Indigenous continuity and presence in the city of Tiohtià:ke. And you can also take a look at the accompanying installation to the film that shares a lot of Amanda's research materials. And in part, the Living Land Acknowledgement really has an emphasis on research undertaken with and for communities. And Open Now, in fact, is the call for the Indigenous Land Restitution Research Creation Fellowship, which is the program within which Amanda's project took place. The deadline on November 23rd. So if any of you joining online, have friends or colleagues who might be interested, please do pass it along. So we're very fortunate to explore our 2025-26 Architecture's Public Concern Fellowship theme, which is the question, how can we build relation? With three researcher artists whose practices expand how relation is sustained, questioned, and maintained. So we have, of course, Nishat Awan, Dima Srouji, and Shahana Rajani. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us here. I'll offer some very brief introductions, and then I'll say a few words on the event. So Nishat is an architect whose work focuses on the intersection of geopolitics and space, including questions related to diaspora, migration, and borders. Her research and practice bring together digital, ethnographic, and field-based approaches in often contested geographies. Nishat is Professor of Architecture and Visual Culture at the UCL Urban Laboratory. Welcome, Nishat. Thanks for joining. Shahana Rajani is an artist exploring the visualities, landscapes, and infrastructures of development, militarization, and ecological resistance in Pakistan. Community-based and collaborative approaches to research are central to her practice. Working across moving image, installation, and printed matter, she engages with dissident histories, lineages, and practices of representation and relation. She's a co-founder of Karachi Lajamia, along with Zara Malkani, an experimental project devoted to seeking and sharing eco-pedagogies that emerge from struggles around land and water in the city. Welcome, Shahana. Thanks for being here. Dima Srouji is a Palestinian architect and visual artist exploring cultural heritage as a space for potential collective repair. She was recently the Jamil Fellow at the Victoria and Albert Museum in 2022-2023, and is currently leading the Studio Underground Palestine in MA City Design at the RCA in London. Welcome, Dima. Thank you for joining us. So Nishat, Shahana, and Dima, in that sequence, will share their research practices around relation building in order to extend the questions that have guided the first two iterations of the Architecture's Public Concern Fellowship, in addition to this most recent one. So who is the work for, and where does the work land? Our 2025 call that addresses the question, how can we build relation, is addressed to members of the CCA Research Network, many of you joining us here today, undertaking public-facing and engaging research related to the built and natural environments, foregrounding how we build relations through architectural research, practice, and speculation. And it's an intentional effort to reflect on the ways we live together in this fraught and charged present moment. We, the CCA Research Network Steering Committee, whose members are here today, who I'll introduce briefly, we ask, how can we build relation? We observe that architecture really holds the power and responsibility to create unique modalities of relation between groups of people, between human and non-human worlds, between built forms and ecologies, and between multiple localities that are connected through networks of abundance and collectivity. As I mentioned, joining us here as well is the CCA Research Network's accomplished and generous steering committee. So this is a group of researchers and CCA alumni who think with the institution to determine questions we should be addressing and who convene this lecture and its companion fellowship program. So a very warm welcome to Ariel Dion Krosnick, Nokubekazele Machunu. I believe Anuradha Siddiqui is joining us or will join very soon. Huda Tayyab and Palin Tan. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining. It's really fantastic to be undertaking all these initiatives with you. And like I said, you are very, very generous with your time and curiosity. In particular, actually, Huda and Palin will enter into conversation with Nishat, Shahana, and Dima at the conclusion of their brief presentations. But before passing it off to Giovanna Barassi, the director of the CCA, who'll say a little bit more about the CCA Research Network and the role it plays in the institution, specifically for members of the CCA Research Network who are joining this morning, this lecture is really an opportunity to open up the theme of the Architecture as Public Concern Fellowship and really exemplify through the work of Nishat, Shahana, and Dima what kinds of projects can extend how we conceive of relation building in our shared and unevenly experienced present moment. So with that, Giovanna, if you feel ready, perhaps you can say a few words on the network and its role for the CCA.
Thanks a lot, Rafiko, and thanks for you all of being here. I don't know if it's morning, afternoon, night. I don't know where you are in the world. Thanks to the steering committee to organize this lecture, and thanks to our lecturer for coming. And I really look forward to your presentation. As you all might know, because you all have been conducting research at the CCA. The CCA was founded with the idea that architecture is a public concern, but especially with the constitution of a collection that was supposed to be not a collection to be shown, but really a collection to be studied. And so research is really the main engine of the institution. And so we are really grateful for all of you coming and engaging with our collection and bringing new way of looking at the material, new way of interpreting the past and the present through this material. A few years ago with Rafiko, we thought like this is an amazing network and it's so important for us to stay in touch and in a way, because we are a research institution, the only way we can be in tune with all of you is to actually understand really what are your concerns, what are the research paths, what are your interests, what are the material that is important for you. And so we thought that to constitute and really, to make it formal, let's say, this is a network that existed, even if it's not formalized, but to make it formalized will actually help us to stay in touch with you, but also you all to connect to each others. And so that's was the idea to create this group and to have a steering committee that I think is changing every 2-3 years. I don't know, Rafiko, what is the timing? And have opportunity for scholars who have been at the CCA in the past or currently at the CCA to connect through this group. I think a new initiative that Rafiko has launched that is called Research in Place will also be an opportunity for scholars to meet. The first one was actually a few days ago in London, hosted by Uda, actually, at the Royal College of Art. And I think, and unfortunately I missed it, but I think the idea is really to continue the dialogue with all the scholars and understanding of like how the research or the time they have spent at CCA has been productive for them and how they have continued their research. And there will be another one in next January, I think at Yale. I'm sure Rafiko will talk more about this. But so the idea is to activate this group sometimes virtually, sometimes in different location in order to really connect everyone and connect you with the CCA. And as I said, for me and Rafiko and the other CCA staff, this is an opportunity to really listen to you, listen where you think research should go and how an institution like the CCA can best support your work.
Wonderful. Thanks, Giovanna. Yeah, I'll mention a bit more detail actually around previous event and the upcoming event at Yale that Giovanna mentioned. At the conclusion of the event, I'll say just a couple words because you'll be getting some news around that through the newsletter quite appropriately. So yeah, so with that, I think we should jump in to Nishat, Shahana's, and Dima's presentations. Like I said, the structure is very simple. They'll each speak for about 15 minutes. And then that will flow into Palin and Huda moderating a conversation on behalf of the steering committee. And then, of course, steering committee members might jump in with a question or two, and then we'll open it to everyone joining here online. So if you feel ready, Nishat, I can kind of pass the unmuted mic to you.
Thank you so much to the CCA for the invitation and to the advisory committee also for the invitation. I'm going to jump right in. So I'm going to speak around a project that I've been involved in for the last few years called Topological Atlas that really explores borders in relation to infrastructural development, ecological breakdown, various kinds of cross-border exchanges, and the clandestine movement of people across that, so undocumented migration. And we've been working in a number of different locations. So we've been working at the India-Pakistan border, the Pakistan-Iran and the Iran-Turkey borders, particularly thinking with the kind of mountainous context of the Pakistan-Iran and the Iran-Turkey borders, and then really think this sort of the coastal geography of the Arabian Sea coast from India through Pakistan to Iran. So the image that you see on the screen is some work by Ishita Sharma, who was one of the PhDs associated with the project, and she's been working in the intertidal geographies of Kutch near the border with Pakistan and India. And she's looking at community histories, vocabularies, and ways of navigating these kind of submerged grounds at the border and working with pastoral and fisher communities. And so when I say we, there's actually quite a lot of us involved in the project. I'm not going to go through everyone, but I've mentioned their names as their work comes up. You know, there's a lot of us from different backgrounds: architects, artists, anthropologists, media kind of scholars, computational designers. And our work is really addressing the movement and exchange and relation that happens across borders. And then particularly focusing on the many different ways in which those who are sort of caught within the logic of borders cope with these very difficult situations. And so from the outside, the work has really had two different concerns, I would say. On the one hand, it is what I just explained, this kind of coastal geography, the mountainous landscapes, the ecologies of the border, and particularly working with the border communities themselves. And then on the other hand, we were concerned with those who cross borders, so those who are living incredibly unsettled lives. And somehow there was always this kind of contradiction between the concerns of marginalized communities, you know, local and indigenous communities who are kind of cut across by what are, you know, colonial borders, militarized, quite heavy borders, and then those who cross it, who somehow through their very existence, I would say, and the modality of living are challenging ideas of rootedness. And so throughout the project, it's interesting that this call is about building relation, because the main sort of question that we were concerned with in this project, we realized, was exactly this question of relation. So how to build relation across the settled and the unsettled. So there was always this kind of back and forth in the project, how to hold two very different modalities of life together while not negating either. And as I say, this is, you know, it's quite difficult within the kinds of contexts we were working in, you know, state repression, hardening of borders, all sorts of kind of extractive geographies. And somehow, I suppose, when we think of sort of challenging ideas of rootedness in the global north or the west, we're kind of on solid ground, right? It's very easy to take a position for refugee politics, for a kind of no borders point of view, and see that as part of an anti-fascist politics. But in these other contexts where you have marginalized border communities who are under pressure through the hardening of borders, which are often seen as the fault somehow of the migrant subject, we get into quite difficult terrain. And this is a terrain that we've had to negotiate very carefully because these are often places of ethnic conflict. So, for example, at the Pakistan-Iran border where we've been working, it's a colonial border that cuts across the Baloch community, and they have been fighting for self-determination. And a lot of the migrants that are moving up from Punjab, which is the most populous kind of state-related province in Pakistan. And so you can see these kind of incredibly complex conditions that come in. And so this is something that we've been working with. We've done a kind of series of, we've worked mostly through workshops, doing work in particular geographical locations. So this is an early workshop we did in Gawada, which is a town on the Arabian Sea coast of Pakistan, quite close to the Iranian border. And here we were thinking and working with the Mahigi community, the fisherfolk community of that area, and really thinking about how their lives are entangled across the land and the sea. So these were a series of workshops organized with Lajbird, who's a research collective based in Pakistan, led by Zara Hussain, who's also part of the project, working with methods of kind of visual methods, community engagement. And then this work was sort of taken on further by Asim Rafiki, who's a PhD on the project, and his work was really thinking about, using techniques of mapping and working with this kind of geography of the Mahigi community that was being erased and has almost sadly completely been erased through large-scale infrastructural development that's happening in this area, which is part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. So deep sea port was already there, but large roads and infrastructure development that's really pushing the fisherfolk community away from the sea itself. And so Asim's a photographer, so he uses photography to kind of convey a sense of the pressures that this community is under. And then on the other side, we're trying to understand the border from the other side, right, as a kind of carceral technology and one that produces violence for those who cross it. And so the anthropologist Shahana Rajani, I think, describes this really well, as that borders produce this kind of controlled movement of people that are sent back and forth between undocumentedness and deportability. And as he says, between countries, between laws, between institutions. And for us, this focusing on this in-between condition became incredibly important. So thinking with those who cross borders, who are in between these various things, institutions, but also those who live amongst borders and are caught in between the kind of pressures of border relations and are affected by them. And so we considered the relationalities produced through the movement, displacement, and exchange that happens across borders, and considered how ordinary people affect, circumvent, and sometimes, and this I think is a really important point, sometimes also reproduce the borders that they pass through. So it's not so much, these things are kind of quite entangled as well. And so in many ways, the project was a kind of, I would say, a reaction to a certain kind of migration discourse, that certainly was happening in Europe, but I think in the global north or the west, however you want to call it, where migration discourse is very much policy-led, is led through the concerns of the north. And so we were thinking with what Lina Siraj, who's also one of the researchers on the project, terms the dreams, delusions, and deceptions of borders. So thinking about how these kinds of ways in which the border kind of affects the migrant subject, how these are endured as a kind of rite of passage and through an appeal to saints, to symbols, to kind of the sharing of stories. So really thinking about what gives someone the faith or the will to carry on. And so what you see here on the screen, the text is a quote from one of the many conversations, interviews we had with people on the move, and I'll read from it. There was a mosque called Bilal Habshi. We didn't know that terminal and bus stop were the same thing. We kept walking around the bus station looking for a terminal. they had told us that the police don't arrest you at terminals, so we had to find this place called Terminal. We stayed the night at the mosque. There were some pear trees there. When we got hungry, we picked some pears and had water from there. We slept before the mosque. And so really in this work, I suppose there's a question of representation, right? How to share these stories and to do them justice. The image on the left of the screen is from a film that we produced as part of a project called Jungle. And as you can see, it's a kind of mixture of animation, but it also layers different languages together. And so we've been thinking about ideas of untranslatability, but also sort of what gets lost in translation, right? So this question of the terminal in this particular quote. And so the film is sort of, I don't have time to show it, but the film is narrated through a series of quotes, interviews, conversations that we had with migrants, with refugees, but also with border officials. So kind of, low-level border officials who are often also kind of part of the border community. So bringing all these different narratives together in a kind of thread is what the Jungle film was sort of doing. And so within these kinds of conversations, the border really emerges, I would say, as a kind of spectral entity in the lives and dreams of those who wish to cross it. And of course, all relations are a form of exchange. And somehow we also found that border crossers haunt that border. And these hauntings can be heard in the words and phrases that people use. So often they speak of their journeys as paddle or on foot. The places along the way might be khwab guards or dream houses or shock houses. The anecdotes and advice on which many rely are considered as secrets passed along from one person to another. So this term secrets and thinking with the idea of the secret was something that Zara Milkani, whom Shahana works very closely with, of course, Zara Milkani was one of the artists we worked with on the project, and her response to the work was very much through thinking with the secret as something that's passed along as people cross borders. And so the burden of these journeys can be very heavy, but relations made along the way ease the path. And these encounters are full of, as I said, dreams, despair, delusions, but also forms of accompaniment. And I'm using this word accompaniment in the way Abdulmalik Simone uses it. So accompaniment is a technology of not just survival, but a kind of mode of living for those who are sort of living very precarious and often unsettled lives. So Simone defines accompaniment as a submergent infrastructure in precarious and improvised lives. So you might accompany someone for a while, you might go with them, see if something happens, whether a relation is made or not, and then you might move on. And I think this is very different, again, from the kind of usual conversations, especially around migration, where people speak a lot about the kind of social networks that people rely on. I think accompaniment works in a very different modality, which is closer to that of relation, perhaps, And so acquaintances and sometimes friends are made and lost, but these entangled relations rarely produce perfect victims for humanitarian redress that Western refugee politics often hinges upon. Instead, we find a different kind of life at the border. There are those whose precarious labor services everyday aspects of border life, such as the petty official who checks IDs at random, or the smuggler who can help you pass through a checkpoint undetected. There is also the churail, or the witch, that haunts the crossroads where oil flowing across the Pakistan-Iran border mingles with the people who hope to make their way westward. There are the flashing lights in the distance and the sound of the wind as symbols of a border having been crossed. And yet this is not the national border between Iran and Turkey, but one of the many intricate borders that overlay it, demarcating the territories and spheres of influence of those who facilitate crossing. So this kind of this sort of thin border between those who cross and those who facilitate is also something that we were kind of thinking about, how, well, we put people in categories of migrant, refugee, border official, etc., etc. Actually, these categories are very fluid and people move across them quite easily depending on circumstance. So in the book Border as Method, Sandra Misadra and Brett Nielsen described the border as a device for the multiplication of labor. And this is, I'm sure many of you will have heard of, this is a highly influential understanding of the way borders operate within globalized economies that corral people into places where the labor can be best exploited for economic purposes. And the right of how borders act as devices for ordering, sifting, and managing flows. And in some ways, this is, of course, indisputable. And in our research, we've met many who were sort of working precarious jobs on shop floors and small-scale factories and workshops. They were working until the time they might be deported, only to try to come back again if they had the health and the means to do so. These mostly young men were driving the engines of an economy that considered them nothing more than labor. But those same people who can only be understood as labor in the factory are other people when in the market or at the mosque or conversing with those living in borders. And so we carried out a series of kind of workshops in various places where we were working, trying to sort of understand these geographies. That might include the buses that take people on their journeys, the small roadside store where they might eat, or the domain of the petty official mentioned earlier, half-heartedly checking identification documents. And in these small-scale encounters, there's no disentangling of the border from the landscape, the seascapes, the ecologies, people and practices that intersected. So you see some of the researchers from the project working here. It's a kind of, on the image, it was a workshop in Istanbul at Salt, Yalta.com. It's also part of the Razi assembly of Pelens, so a few overlaps. And so somehow we were trying to sort of make sense of these kind of entanglements that we see in border politics. And we've really been working with Anna Singh's notion of patchiness. So Singh urges us to consider the way many different systems coexist and overlap. And I quote from her, not only ecological models and theories of political economy, but also what we might call, for want of a better word, non-secular cosmologies. And so we've been thinking a lot with this notion of border mythologies and of migrants and refugees as one amongst many producers of knowledge on the border. And so recent scholarship on the border has rightly emphasized the racialized nature of border politics, but I think it may also be useful to consider how a particular lens on the border passes out the non-secular, the indigenous, and other forms of worlding and belief structures that are often a sense of strength, of solace, and resistance. And these forms of knowing and of abstraction sit next to the border, acting as the filtering, sorting, ordering device that Mazarka and Nielsen speak about for the production of labor. And so Anna Singh writes, patches are sites for knowing intersectional inequalities amongst humans, and what better patch to think through these inequalities than the border itself. So I'm going to take one more minute just to kind of show you this, which is the last few images that you saw on the screen were from a digital platform that we built that allows sort of one to navigate the archives that we've collected across this kind of long project that took around 6-7 years. And it works by aggregating fragments of text and image. And it's kind of an experiment into forms of mechanical navigation. And so the person interacting with it is sort of invited to trace parts intuitively that form relations across these fragments, and then produces narratives and stories from the archive. So I invite you all to have a look at it. It's available on the address here, and I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nishat. It's fantastic. Yeah, this question of building relation across the settled and the unsettled is really kind of anchoring the topological atlas project. I mean, I think it'll be nice, yeah, maybe when Palin and Huda open this line of questioning to really understand this multi-dimensionality of relation that you're tracking as well across like the kind of both within the community of the unsettled and the migrant, and then like those points of extension to more kind of settled communities. I think it could be very interesting. So thank you for sharing that. I know it felt rushed, probably. But it didn't seem rushed. That's the key thing. I'll pass it on to Shahana if you feel ready.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Nishat. I think there's already so many threads and intersections across what we'll be speaking about. So I'm looking forward to the conversation after. Let me actually share. So what I thought to share with everyone today is a recent and ongoing project where I have been researching and seeking the histories, lineages, and practices of representation, especially in relation to representing landscapes that are undergoing immense devastation, immense destruction, and annihilation. And this kind of question, similar to Nishat's question of how to build relation across the settled and unsettled, I've really been driven by this question of how to build how to build relation through representation amidst a visual field that is so saturated with the violences of visuality, with the legacies of colonialism. And I think what I'll do before I get into the specific project, which looks at the site of the Indus Delta in Pakistan, where the border of India, Pakistan, as Nishat was mentioning, also lies. I wanted to kind of foreground my own artistic and research practice within my collective pedagogical project of Karachi La Jamia, a project that I run with my friend and artist Zara Malkani, and which we founded in 2015. Karachi La Jamia means, I guess, would roughly translate into anti-university or outside the university or a refusal of the university. And we founded this at a moment when we were both teaching in universities in Karachi, and we were growing increasingly alarmed by the militarization of campuses and of urban spaces across the city. We also at that time were thinking a lot about the simultaneous sort of repression and depoliticization in the realms of knowledge and cultural production. And we started this project as a way to experiment with practices of collective learning and to really think about study as a way in which we can build connection and solidarity and community to connect really with so many of the ongoing struggles around land and water that were happening at that time, that the campus of the university is completely set apart from. But also at that time, we were realizing that the ways in which education was also being instrumentalized by the military and development nexus. So Karachi's largest public university, that's called Karachi University, that gets built in the 60s is actually built on the occupation and annihilation of the largest pasture land across that region. And in the making of the campus of the university, that entire landscape ecology communities are incredibly affected. And so we've also kind of been thinking a lot about how the very structure and materiality and walls of the campus, by its very nature, erase and dispossess and destroy land. And how do we repair or rebuild some of those relationships and make the kinds of study and research we do integral to reconnecting ourselves with the lands that we inhabit and the histories of inhabitation of the land, and also the ecological knowledges that have very much been fostered alongside it. And so this is kind of the kind of longer context in which a lot of my research has happened, a lot of which is often collaborative, is often community-based. Me and Zara have been organizing public workshops and courses with Indigenous activists and activist organizations in the city to build curricular and to build programs of study where we can build solidarity with these struggles. And I think one thing in this work that we've repeatedly come up against is the politics of representation and the ways in which seeing and unseeing of landscapes are two sides of the same coin, and how much visual regimes and what Samia Heni calls regimes of emptiness are being deployed by real estate, by the government, by the military, to really obscure and delimit our relationship to land and to really legitimize the violence and erasure of development and infrastructure. And we've been doing a lot of mapping work with communities. We've really learned from activists how much the map form is used to erase land. So always being pointed out how much the survey maps of Karachi, for instance, are always representing the peripheries of the city as empty land, as barren land, as a desert wasteland, in an effort to legitimize the occupation of development, and how these representations are constantly erasing and disallowing us to see what actually exists. And then this, me and Sarah have also been thinking a lot about other kinds of maps that have been circulating around Karachi in the last decade, especially at a time in the 2010s when there was a series of military operations ongoing in the city linked to the post 9/11 global order. And in these maps, we were also noticing how often it was that what I'm displaying is a map of no-go zones or terror zones in Karachi. And we were noticing how often these maps were focusing on the peripheries of the city, where again, real estate wants to use that land, and how often it was targeting both refugee and indigenous neighborhoods to label them as red zones, as terror zones. And then often what was happening is that military operations would be followed by mega real estate projects. And so the past decade, we've really been kind of grappling with the question, the power and the violence of the image, of the map, of representation, really grappling with, Donna Haraway's provocation of this question, asking ourselves, like, with whose blood are my eyes crafted? To really think about, as she asks of us, who to see with, how to see, where to see from, and all of these kind of questions we've been grappling collectively and often with communities through the guidance and experience of communities who are at the receiving end of all of these projects. And I guess a project that I thought to share today is one that emerges from these questions and also the heaviness and cynicism that emerges around representation, the hopelessness that you feel when you're constantly seeing the ways in which visual violence has incredibly material consequences. I wanted to share this project I've been working on for the past 5-6 years that's and again in collaboration with activists of the Pakistan Fisherfolk Forum and with fisher communities from the Indus Delta to think about this question of representation. And I initially got interested in the site because I came across these maps in the archives. These are colonial maps. And you see that in the Delta region, all of these colonial maps from the late 1800s and early 1900s are all constantly, like, red lines are marking everything. You're seeing the ways in which the coastline is changing, the river is changing, that the borders between land and water that the map seeks to produce are breaking down. And so I was interested in the Delta as a site really where the map comes undone, and to really think about what are representational practices in this really fluid and watery landscape. How are people navigating and representing? And so that was sort of the initial premise. But as I started traveling with fishers and with activists across the Delta, I was also really struck by the immensity of erasure because of water infrastructure. The river's gone missing, and the sea is really fast submerging land to the point where today only 8% of the Delta remains. And so most people, most communities have been forced to leave the Delta. And I guess immediately this kind of really, the research question I set off with felt so irrelevant in this landscape where people are navigating such big and immense things. And so I sort of we were just doing these trips and traveling through the Delta and in landscapes where everything has been destroyed, homes, villages, markets, graveyards. The only structures that we did find were shrines. And these shrines are built, there's a dense network of shrines that continues to exist against all odds in the Delta. And there, I began to notice that the stories people were telling, or the way in which even the fisherfolk were navigating, because these are the only structures that remain, these shrines are really central to the way in which people navigate the Delta. They form these miraculous anchors through which people continue to relate to a really defamiliarizing and a really precarious and fast-changing landscape. And people would share these incredible stories of miracles through which the land where these shrines are continued to persist against all odds. And that there were these architectures of mobility that were forming around these shrines, these miracles of repair and recovery, so much communications happening through the dream world. And so even though I started with these colonial maps, the kind of research really led me to think about and center these sacred geographies of the Delta and to really think about how the shrines enable people to continue relating to landscapes that are disappearing and to landscapes that are incredibly endangered. But I think a question that I really had through this process of research over a couple of years that I wanted to center in this presentation was most of the journeys I was making, I had my camera and I was filming these spaces, but there was something about pointing a camera to these spaces and filming that just didn't feel right. It felt, I had an immense discomfort with filming these spaces that felt so sacred and so revered, but also spaces that were so precarious and so vulnerable. And I was really asking myself this question of what does it mean for me to center these spaces in this film project that I'm working on? And what does it mean for me to feed these spaces into the global art and exhibition economy? And really thinking about what are the ways in which I could represent that would feel respectful, that would feel like the space is being honored. And as I was sort of grappling through these questions, and years went by, and I'm sitting on all this footage, but just not being able to make anything of it because it just wasn't sitting right. I came across this really incredible representational practice that communities of the Delta who have been displaced, for instance, to the city of Karachi and are living in Fisher neighborhoods, these are murals that I started to see and notice in these neighborhoods. And I mean, this was the first mural that I remember seeing, and immediately I was just really drawn to this mural, and it felt like the most alive and dynamic map or landscape that I had seen. It was made by a family who was displaced to Karachi in the 90s. And they said that the first thing we did when we got displaced is we hired a painter from our community, a boat painter, and asked him to make a mural of our village, our creek, our shrine. And this painting helps to keep us connected to our disappearing worlds. And it's the primary mode in which we continue to seek connection in this concrete urban jungle of Karachi. And so I think the more time I spent in these community spaces, the more time I spent with some of the painters and some of the patron families of these murals, it became really evident that these practices, it is through these practices that I can learn and seek some of the answers to the questions that I was struggling with and so stuck on. And it became really clear to me that these painting practices were so vital for this community, and that painting here was not a secular practice. It wasn't just an objective, picturesque landscape that was being made, but it was really a sacred ritual almost, through which people were continuing to protect, to invoke, to remember, to enliven, to animate their increasingly endangered worlds. And so the film then, rather than becoming about me filming the shrine sites, became about these painters and these painting practices in the community. And really, I guess the project has really been an attempt to think about what does it mean, or what could it mean to center and honor practices of self-representation by communities who are undergoing immense catastrophe, and how to center, how to honor those practices, and what we have to learn from them, and let them even perhaps transform our own relationship to image making. And maybe just to end on, I know, Rafiko, I'm a few minutes over time already. This is Ustad Aziz. He's one of the senior most painters of Ibrahim Hedri, this fisher settlement in Karachi. And something that the painters actually helped me to understand is also think a little bit about the history of representation, where in my past work, I was constantly coming up against the wall of the colonial map and feeling like all of our representational technologies arise from those origins. But I think this project and the fisher communities have really also helped me and taught me lineages of representation of drawing that exist outside of those frameworks and outside of those genealogies. And so part of the project that then also kind of the film looks at is a really ancient and old practice of drawing, which is of the knowledge of drawing talismans, where the talisman is drawn, is thought to be the oldest knowledge, the oldest gift of knowledge that God gives Prophet Adam. And it is his four talisman makers. This knowledge of the talisman, this knowledge of the dot and line, is a knowledge from which all other knowledges emerge. Language and script emerges from that. It's this really primary form of knowledge in which God has encoded answers to all our questions, to all knowledges, and it's really gifted to Adam as a pedagogy for navigating grief, separation, and this question of how to reconnect with the divine in the moment when he is banished to earth. And so I've also really been then thinking about what these in my context, at least, kind of these Islamic practices, these mystical practices of talisman making, how they link up to these painting practices, and are really teaching us how alive representational practice can be, and are teaching us all of the possibilities of connection that exist in the field of representation, if only one knows where to look. So maybe I will stop there.
Thanks so much. Thank you for sharing all that. Also, thank you for kind of honesty, in this shift in perspective, going from within the film, like going from the shrines to the paintings and the painters. Like, I mean, I think it's the hope for these kinds of events, like the Architecture's Public Concern Lecture, and then also the Place of Research event series, is that it is a space that researchers can share this kind of process work and this, yeah. And for that, you have to be kind of honest sometimes when you need to, in understanding this question of kind of community accountability and relation, when it's important to pivot like that. And I imagine many are curious about the film. So I'll leave it to you. I mean, how you think you want to share it, or if it's going to be, in some gallery spaces or online. Yeah, this is something maybe we could talk about more later. And same for Nishat as well, in fact. But at the moment, Dima, if you feel ready, perhaps we'll go to you.
Yes. to start off, I wrote a couple of words down last year, around a year into genocide in Palestine, and it feels right for me to kind of frame my practice in relation to the current context that we're living in today. So I'd like to read very briefly first, and I think it also helps kind of contextualize my practice in relation to genocide. I think most Palestinians are struggling right now to articulate their artwork in this context. So this writing has kind of helped me figure out what we're doing and why, but yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it later as well. So we are simultaneously fighting against apartheid and now genocide while finding ways to imagine liberation and return. We Palestinians inside and outside of the land are in a constant search in and on the ground for something that we are in the process of articulating while genocide unfolds and the dust has yet to settle. Palestinians are beginning to understand that there is a relationship between our ascent towards liberation and our burial in the ground. The subterranean rise, a contradiction that defines much of what it means to be Palestinian today, is by design. The louder and more present our voice, the deeper we are penetrated into mass tombs. However, the systems at hand are making an ontological error. They've forgotten that for us to rise, we must first ascend. Liberation for Palestinians begins below, in the strata in and between our remnants and in the cosmic realm above simultaneously. The land is our battleground and our burial place, but it's also our witness, our archive, and our paradise. The vertical dimension flows between the real and the surreal in Palestine. The viral chant, Jannah, 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 describes this contradiction of heaven on earth, a death in the land, and an afterlife underground. This intervention moves vertically, from grain to cosmos, from subterranean ruins to imagined futures, unearthing the political, emotional, and material memories embedded in the ground. And as the dust sets on mounds of rubble over miles of destroyed lives in Gaza, we can only imagine that the scale expanding to the West Bank while holding our breaths. In between the nightmares, both awake and at night, Palestinians everywhere are consciously and subconsciously building an imagination of liberation. Whether that is through our senses, smelling olive oil that your mom brings from home to your London apartment, or a small matluba gathering in a Boston apartment, or a sonic performance in the halls of the Wonder Cabinet in Beit Lahem, liberation is constant and is already taking place. So to create a metaphysical state of return and resistance, the imaginary is crucial for us to access that space in order for it to ripple into the physical. And so making and teaching for me is the way I try to reach as close as possible to what liberation might feel like, building relations, making spaces, objects, archives, casts, films, and text. It allows me to unfold potential motions of liberation alongside my collaborators. Working with artisans and makers in Palestine, with materials of the ground, where each material, like glass and stone, they become the lenses in which the stories that deserve some light begin to unravel. And so since the land is in itself the medium in which apartheid takes place, and the layers below and above the Earth's surface is where injustice happens, it must also be where liberation does too. In a recent interview, Palestinian scholar Nadira Shalhoub-Kevorkian recounted a poignant story of a young girl in Gaza who, amidst the aftermath of bombing, pleaded with her cat to promise not to eat her if she were to die. So this plea stemmed from the child witnessing her community collect dismembered body parts into labeled boxes and bags, a grim reality under genocide. Sorry, maybe I should have had a trigger warning. The Arabic term ashla is used to describe such dismemberment. And unlike the English term, ashla conveys the visceral texture of torn flesh and the spatial scattering of body parts. Yet it retains an inherent sense of the whole. In the case of the boxes and bags, to the families collecting them, they understand the bag as the whole rather than his or her parts. A father carrying bags of his son's parts, according to Shalhoub-Kevorkian, he is refusing orphaning. So building upon this concept, scholar Dr. Jasbir Puar introduces the framework of rememberment. This perspective emphasizes recognizing and honoring the wholeness of the collective Palestinian body, even in the face of physical fragmentation and violence. Puar's analysis suggests that despite the apparent dismemberment of Gaza and by extension Palestine, there exists an unfragmented phantom object of the whole. And so integrating the insights of Nadira Shalhoub-Kevorkian and Puar, we have an offering here, an understanding of this phantom whole, the process of rememberment as a continuous practice of liberation. And so the works that I'll show you today kind of try to hallucinate on this phantom object and inhabit in waking life and in the dream state simultaneously. The project here in these images is a research project from the last 3 years. I've been working on it with a collaborator, Huda Shawwa Qadoumi. It's going to be a permanent installation for the Palestinian Museum in the Gardens in Birzeit. Hopefully by March we'll have it up. The research is kind of looking at the dismembered archaeological site of Tal Ajul, which is ancient Gaza. It was excavated by the British in the 1930s. Hundreds of thousands of artifacts were taken, including human remains from ancient Gaza to the UK and other countries. Most of them are now at the UCL Institute of Archaeology and elsewhere in Manchester and at the British Museum. So some of the installations that we're looking at for this is to kind of think about what are the remnants of these archaeological excavations? Where are they today? Who excavated them? What happened to the site today? Who are the rightful owners of the site? And how can we kind of restitch these fragments into an installation that not only kind of brings back the dismembered parts into some kind of whole, but also to talk to the Palestinian audience about the richness of their context. Most people, Palestinians in Palestine even, don't know about the history of ancient Gaza. So this is a critical kind of moment in my practice. It's kind of thinking about archaeology in a new way in relation to genocide simultaneously. And some of the replicas we're making in a really large scale with incredible artisans, both in Palestine and in Cairo. Cairo, because there is this kind of ancient Egyptian relationship with Gaza that's also very strong. So we're making these gigantic replicas and placing them into the Palestinian Museum garden, also kind of as an exercise in restitution, because the original gold pendants are all on display at the British Museum and elsewhere. So there's this exercise in imagining what return might look like or feel like. Through the research, we've also found documentation on the list of landowners of Tal Ajul, which is ancient Gaza. Some of these families have been entirely exterminated, and some of them still alive. So we're currently looking at inviting them to come see the Palestinian Museum show, and it does open. This was their land, so a lot of the artifacts that were displaced and taken and looted from the site are theirs historically, and they were the rightful owners during the excavations. And some of them live in the West Bank today, some of them live in Jordan and Kuwait and so on, and some of them unfortunately are no longer with us. So thinking about rememberment as method for this other project, we have here a project titled Maintaining the Sacred, which looks at this kind of more architectural history of fragmentation in relation to Islamic architecture. We have something called the Qamariya window, which is the Qamariya window, meaning the moon window, which was historically used in the clear story windows in domestic spaces and in public spaces, especially in mosques. It comes from Yemen, where it was excavated and kind of perforated out of alabaster stone to filter moonlight into the domestic space. And then it transitions into kind of a plaster engraving practice over the years, and then with colored glass inlays afterwards. There are about 33 colored glass windows at the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. This man, Abu Muhammad, in the image, is one of the masters in the world of making Qamariya windows. They're all hand carved in plaster. Each one takes about 6 months to make. And unfortunately, he just retired. He was the last one in Palestine. There are, at the moment, many of them are broken. About half of the Qamariya windows are broken because the IOF, the Israeli Offensive Forces, uses the windows as access points for tear gas, especially during Ramadan on Fridays. So if we calculated the repair for each one of them, it would be around 6 months per piece. So around a total of 15 years to repair all of them. And as a response to this kind of violent destruction of cultural heritage, I worked on an installation for the Islamic Art Biennial in Jeddah in 2023, where I replicated the scale of one of the windows, but instead of kind of replicating the image directly or the kind of the ornament and the geometry, the Islamic geometries directly, there's a kind of an illustrative, imaginary, and approach to making here that comes slightly from some of the original motifs, but also tells a story of the way that the public space is being used as the last Palestinian public space in Jerusalem. This is where children play football. This is where mothers have picnics waiting for prayer time. It's beautifully shaded. There are lots of trees. So some of those trees are also identified in the design of the installation. Some of the motifs on the edges come from the architecture of the interior of the Dome of the Rock as well. And the wood structure remains there as a kind of in honor of the craftsman Abu Muhammad, who was constantly repairing the Qamariya windows. And the work was produced in Palestine with Munir Nasser, who's an incredible stone artisan in Beit Lahem. And the colored glass was also made in Palestine with the Tuam family, who I've been working on for many years. This is a series of similar kind of interventions using the same materials, Jerusalem stone and colored glass inlay, where the stone here is used as stone instead of plaster, which it was historically as a kind of reflection on permanence rather than fragility, and playing with how do we transform something that's easily destroyed by the Israeli occupation forces to something that retains some meaning in terms of materiality, material culture, and heritage, but at the same time has this kind of the strength and quality can go through the test of time as well. So this is an installation called Late Monuments that's also done with the same collaborators, alongside an archaeologist, Dr. Silvia Truini, who is an Italian archaeologist that's been living in Palestine for a long time, for decades. And it's a series of kind of dismembered archaeological sites in Palestine across 7 sites in historic Palestine, both in West Bank and 48, where we did a lot of research on the history of excavation. I'll show you an image of some of this, the photographs of excavation and how that happened. But the idea here was that they were both imaginary, fictional, and accurate drawings taken from those sites. So some of the drawings and the plans on there are from the archaeological sites that we surveyed, and others are kind of imaginary to play with the idea of what could a future archaeological site look like in Palestine if those sites were to remain under a liberated Palestinian space. These are some of the images of the Palestinian women, actually, called basket girls, who were nicknamed basket girls by the American and British archaeologists as early as 1908. Harvard University did a lot of excavations as early as 1908 in sites like Samaria and Sebastia and Gaza in the 30s as well. And they hired hundreds of Palestinian women to do the excavations for them, under the watchful eye of the archaeologist, who would stand there usually with a white umbrella telling them where to go. And you can see in these images that the beauty of kind of the relationship of the excavator, the basket girl, with the artifacts that they're finding, because they're finding artifacts that they would have been using not so long ago. You know, these pendants of the goddess Ashtart were worn even by my great grandmother as as good luck for fertility, for example. She's the goddess of love and war. She's very present in excavations in Gaza as well. And they remind us of our grandmother's bodies, right? That there's this kind of the symbol of fertility, the symbol of nurture. And there's this irony that the Palestinian women are the ones that are excavating their own land as well. They had to cut down the trees they had to that they own, the olive groves and the orchards and so on. They had to cut them down and excavate them to bring out their goddesses so that they could then just be taken to the British Museum. And in kind of in honor of that, our grandmothers, I did this installation called Maternal Labor, where I created a series of images that think of them as almost like religious icons, as if they were the Virgin Mary, where you have there's this almost spiritual relationship that I have to them. And so the three arches are reminiscent of kind of Orthodox Christian iconographies, bringing them to kind of that level of importance. You can see in the images they did not want to be photographed, but they were being photographed by the British excavators to and to cast them as types as well. This photograph that I found at the Palestine Exploration Fund was called Types of Palestinian Women. This is an installation also as a response to some of that research where the goddess Ashtar is dismembered. It's a larger work. The original pendant is about 2-3 centimeters. This is about 70 centimeters tall. She's pregnant, but she's also headless without her limbs, with a hole in her belly. The collage in the background is a series of negatives that I've been collecting over the last few years to kind of build a relationship between there are, for example, on the top left, you see a photograph of the Palestinian glassblowers from Hebron in the 1970s. There's another one where you can see Palestinian stone carvers working in the factories. You can see on the right, there's also the pottery makers. So the objects are always in relationship with the context in which they come from. I try to do that at least. And so in this case, Ashtat is dismembered, but she's kind of still standing and made out of stone and made out of Jerusalem stone. And the stone has this kind of reddish vein to it, which is kind of very similar to skin. So it has this eerie, like living quality to it. And finally, this is part of the same exhibition where, speaking of, Shahana was talking about shrines and the importance of making votives and so on. And this is, I was really interested in this relationship to the votives that we use in Palestine, sometimes made out of beeswax, which is the same material we use for the church rituals of Saturday of Light, the Saturday of Easter. But sometimes they're made like with little hands or legs or a pregnant belly as either as to give as a votive to the church to say thank you for healing my body, or for wishing or praying for a healing and so on. As a response to that, or kind of in relation to genocide as well, I wanted someone to enter into the space to kind of have a moment of silence in this room where there's also Byzantine chants playing in the background before they get to see the rest of the exhibition, to kind of ground you also in this moment that we're in today. And the artifacts here, partially my own, where I cast my own limbs and in wax. Some of them are from 2D images that I've collected from Gaza, from dismembered bodies, and turned them into 3D objects using photogrammetry, and then turning those into votives. Each one, you can see there's a little tattoo on the leg. Each one is marked with the day of genocide that they were made, as a way for me to mark time. It was a really beautiful ritual for me in my studio to just hold the limbs and to carry them and to spend time carving them, and then hanging them in the space all together, allowing people to come and light a candle underneath. And then so the wax from the top actually melts down slowly as well, and then you recast it again. I'll end on this project. It's a glass project. It's my main material that I've been working with for a really long time, almost 10 years, with these amazing glass blowers called the Twam family in Jaba. And I think it kind of, this idea of the phantom hole comes maybe back again here, where this relationship to looted objects and artifacts is visited here again with the replicas of the original artifacts that were looted from archaeological sites across Palestine and are now in 25 different museums in the world. And what I did was remake them with the Twam family as replicas. The title of the project is Ghosts. Again, imagining kind of this relationship to liberation and restitution. And they were displayed as these kind of standing ghosts in relation to the original object, and some research on the history of glass. And the research on the history of glass is really talking about this river that I thought actually I should speak about, which is the birthplace of glass blowing in the world. It's a small river in Palestine called Nahr al-Na'amin, which was incredibly rich in minerals. Women would go bathe there to cleanse their menstrual cycles, to heal their ailments. And now it's surrounded by a weapons factory, Israeli weapons factory called Rafael Systems, where they make the Iron Dome. But archaeologists found these furnace remains where the mud brick furnaces have the glass melted on them. That's how they know that the glass furnaces were made there. And so as a response to that research, I made an installation called the Red River, which looks at this highly polluted river today that's literally glowing red because of the pollution in the area from the Rafael Systems weapons factory, in relation also to the female body, talking about the history. This is the birthplace of glass blowing in the world. So working with the Tuam family again to make 300 glass artifacts that kind of take the shape of the body of the river. And I will stop there.
Thank you for sharing really those, remarkably, deep and moving projects. And I really appreciated also your opening statement, really kind of being very precise actually about why and how you undertake this work right now. So yeah, thanks for sharing this, Dima. Really meaningful.
Thank you.
So now, yes, we can gather in this online space, and we'll have Palin and Huda kind of open up the conversation between the three of you and the committee. And of course, we have a bit of time. So Becky, Anu, and Ariel, I'm sure the three of you can jump in at some point as well. But for now, yeah, maybe Huda and Palin, if one of you wants to open with a couple remarks and an opening question for Nishat, Shahana, and Dima.
I would like to thank you very much for our panelists, and also thank you very much, Rapiko, and to CCA to providing this opportunity that we were listening very, very unique and very liberational practices. And it is so open to see how this process, I mean, not only the outcome of any medium of such research, but the process of ethically and also the process of hard work and perspectives against colonialism, against genocide, against oppressive other extractivist strategies, how those artists and architects are proceeding with research, pedagogies, and other kind of relationalities. Maybe I have only one question, or just open it a bit about definition. I was feeling that in those commonality of those presentations that material culture pops up with landscape, shrines, talisman, murals, mapping, temporariness and permanency in Nishat's presentation, in Shahana's presentation, and the all resistant materials of Dima and the excavation of future of the past archaeology. And all are having a common points of how to look critically to the term material culture, which is very actually a colonial discipline, a colonial practice and methodology in many institutions, in the museums and other kind of institution is being defined. And I would like to ask maybe to focus to speakers tell a little bit more about how to create this decolonial material culture, how to share with other institutional and non-institutional practices. And I see that here there's a lot of effort to bring this other kind of material culture, a resisting material culture, a decolonial material culture against this all wars, oppression, and genocide. And I wish to hear about this kind of perspective, how we can criticize the term material culture. Thank you.
Yeah, it's really packed and important yet difficult question of like how to decolonize. I feel at least with this project, working with the fisher communities of the Indus Delta and thinking about representational practices, I think one kind of big question or this one way in which yes, you see material culture, but it also completely reframes the way in which you approach material culture is that these landscapes are quite literally disappearing underwater, and that all material remains are, there is no way to excavate, that it is actually through immaterial, devotional, spiritual practices and geographies that that actually animate even the material practices that I was talking about. And so, for instance, kind of many of the shrines survive, but there are also lots of stories of shrines that are, 20, 50 kilometers into the sea by now, where saints show up as apparitions above their shrines and show up to boats and people passing by to remind them of where their graves were. Or I remember one time I was speaking to a fisher activist from the Delta. We were meeting in KT Bandar, which is again a town that has been shifted many times over. And I asked him, I guess this from, again, this research impulse of if he has any photographs of his village that no longer exists, or these really fertile pastoral lands that they were describing to me, the pasture lands. And yeah, I just thought I was asking this really innocent question of, oh, do you have any documents? And he just looked at me so ludicrously that like how I've moved homes 5 times over. Everything I have is undersea. I have no documents. I have no photos to show you. And if you want to learn about our histories, you go to my shrine, because my shrine is the only thing that remains, and my shrine is he used this term Jita Jagta Sabut. It's a living testimony of my whole life, of my whole community. And if if you want an archive, that is where you'll find the archive of our lives. And so, yeah, so of course the shrine is this material structure, but all of these kind of relationalities that exist around it are exceed the material as well. And so I've kind of really been thinking about this kind of even just the category of material and how much it precludes, or how do we think about this term in a more expansive way and not in an object oriented way?
Maybe I could say something around the shrine question. I mean, in our work somehow, material culture, but also visual culture, I think a lot of the work was about, on the one hand, thinking about the overexposure of a certain subject, right, the migrant subject, as somebody who features a lot in all kinds of work, right, on the border. It features in very, very difficult ways. And at the same time, somehow, um, the overexposure of migrant subjects, but also of the border itself within these landscapes. So the border reappearing in many ways. So you were speaking about shrines, Shahana and Gawada, a lot of the shrines to a lot of the shrines to Hazrat Khizr which is a patron saint of the sea, have been sort of brought under the kind of port infrastructure, so people can no longer go to them. And so a lot of the practice was, of course, about going up this mountain, staying at the shrine, looking out to sea, and then coming back down. So as you say, it's not just the shrine itself, it's the geography, the landscape around it that becomes sort of corded off. And so, yeah, for us, understanding also that the border, it's not just the geopolitical border, but how it keeps reappearing through certain kinds of extractive practices. So how we can make the border visible, but make it disappear at the same time in some ways, and how to break it down. And then I suppose the other thing I would say is, and maybe that links a little bit to some of the things that you were saying, Dima, is, I mean, in terms of kind of migration, the question of violence, of course, of the border is always there, but how to sort of speak about the migrant subject not only through violence, right, that they are enduring. And so for us, somebody like Catherine McKittrick became really important in the way she speaks about, Black sense of place, in the sense that how do you move beyond violence as a sole analytic through which you think about certain lives. And so I see that a lot, of course, in your work too. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I guess, yeah, I think in my case it's very object based, and I think the reason that that's the case is, one, I think of them as kind of friends or companions or collaborators in a way. So the objects mean a lot in our world in Palestine. I think also because of the attempts of erasure, or not even attempts, the success of erasure over the last 100 years. And so material culture has been a big part of that. We're being erased so quickly in so many different scales that making is really important to make sure that we're present, as much as possible. And so the objects kind of dissemination or proliferation of material or replicating artifacts that are considered archaeological or even future archaeological is one way of at least my own attempt at making sure that we don't get erased. So that's where that comes from.
Thanks so much. I just want to kind of first reiterate what Pelin said, and a huge thank you to all of you for sharing your work. It was incredibly moving, and I think such interesting resonances across these geographies. I was also really interested in the kind of importance of thinking with the spirit world or dream worlds, and how that operates really differently in each of your works. And I think that you've kind of spoken a bit to that, and this kind of insistence on materiality as much as it's also kind of, so there's this sort of working between the ephemeral, but also the kind of attention to what is there, and ways of both in terms of the kinds of representations that exist through talismans, but also speaking to the kinds of physical geographies. But I think like building on that, my question is about archives, and I was, I guess, thinking also with the CCA and, as a space of collecting archives, and in each of your projects, there's this kind of quite important place of archives, a critique of archives, but also this proposition about potentially another kind of archive that comes through. And yeah, and I would be really interested to hear a bit more about that, I suppose, where you see those tensions, but also where the possibilities for thinking whether this, with the archival, might still lie.
Well, I thought I'd speak with around the kind of digital platform I showed right at the end, um, which is something that sort of, I mean, talking about how things change as part of a kind of long research process. Originally this project was written about kind of trying to map the experience of crossing borders. That was the main kind of goal of it. And so some idea of a kind of mapping platform. But as we went through the project, realizing that we'd collected this huge archive of material that others might want to engage with, but also kind of the ethics, right, of material that's kind of difficult, that it's not always, should be made readily available. And so for us, working with the digital realm was important, partly because we were a huge set of people, a very large set of people working across many different geographies. And then COVID struck in the middle. And suddenly we couldn't meet, but also because not all of us have powerful passports, so some of us couldn't, especially researchers in Pakistan couldn't come to the UK, for example, or to Netherlands, and so there was this question of how this digital platform became both an archive but also a place for us to exchange and work together, and that's really what then pushed it into what it finally became, which is a kind of fragmented representation of what are incredibly fragmented journeys, and so thinking with the archive as a tool for making other stories was really what we were considering, and how that particular archive questioned the idea of the map. What Shahana, you were speaking about, these kind of colonial maps, and how we could think of a form of representation that was actually a negotiation between different people as they moved through this space, right, through this archive, and produced different stories and collaged together many different stories. And there, then, this will be my last one, but then this was also to do with the migrant subject. When you apply for asylum in any of the kind of northern countries, you have to get your story exactly right every single time. Otherwise, you're denied asylum. So part of the fragmentation of stories and to be able to bring them together into one, story that could or couldn't be true was also fighting against this question of the truthful story that might give you asylum. So yeah, in those sense, the archives became important as kind of producing other narratives, I suppose.
I can go next. Huda, I want to start by saying actually that I've been so inspired by your project on archives and archives of forgetfulness. And I think when I was starting my research on the Indus Delta, I came across it and listened to, I think there were podcasts back then. And I feel like, yeah, it really helped me. All the people you brought in and the constellations you formed really helped me to imagine and think about, how archives can take so many different forms and paths, and storytelling is so key to that work. And I guess thinking about the place of the archive in this project that I shared, there's so many things. But I think one, of course, the murals that I was sharing and talking about, and these paintings that uh, displace families from the Delta, ask painters to make for them, are in themselves an archive, in that they are recording and documenting and making accessible public images for the community to access, as they are no longer living next to these shrines and no longer living next to their villages and ancestral creeks. And so the image really becomes a portal. But again, I've been really hesitant, and I've so far kind of avoided the frame of the archive in the film at the very least yet. And I think the reason for that is a really interesting thing that I noticed about these practices is that desire to preserve or make something permanent is not there in the murals at all, because the murals are painted in public space. These walls are painted and repainted. They get broken down. It's kind of, I once went with the painter whose image I'd shown, Ustad Abdulaziz, on a kind of tour to go look with him of all the walls that he's painted. And more than half of the spaces he took me to, the murals were no longer there. And he had the most like, whatever cavalier approach, like, oh yeah, they're gone, no big deal. And I was like, what? You know, how can they have disappeared? But there is this kind of ephemerality to these images where what seems to be important is the making and the gesture of the making as much as it is what remains behind. And so yeah, I've been really interested in the impermanence of these images, and also this kind of when these painters are making these murals, there's also this kind of understanding that these images are really veiled. So again, these archives are not operating in a way to make everything visible. So this is also in the context of growing, for instance, conservative revisionings of Islamic practice, where shrine culture is not something that you want to announce so much out loud. Especially in some of these working class neighborhoods. And so the painters and the communities really describe the murals as a veil sometimes, where they'll talk about, you know, when you go fishing and you see the surface of the ocean, you can never penetrate it with your eyes. You can never see the fish directly. The surface is a veil, it covers. And only those who are trained, those who know how to sense, who've done the work of attuning their senses, will be able to sense and catch the fish. And the painters describe these murals in the act of painting in a similar way, where the surface is a veil, and only those who know what to see will get connected. And so yeah, there's something really interesting in it about access and visibility that I feel is interesting to think about in relation to archives.
I don't know. I have this kind of funny relationship with archives. They're like the best thing in the world, and then they're the worst thing in the world in other ways. I mean, one example of like a horrible experience with archives, and the horrible ones are always with British institutions, but like we have this incredible archive of the Gaza archaeology collection and the excavation archives at the Institute of Archaeology, and it's just been pulling hair out, trying to get access to our own stuff. You know, like these are materials that came from Palestine, that are from Gaza, that mean a lot to us today. And having people that are in charge of these collections refuse to cooperate or refuse to kind of help with accessing for different reasons has been kind of a nightmare. So the access to archives is always really stressful and difficult. And you know, also like what is an archive, right? Like there are human remains in the basement of Cambridge University now from Gaza from the 1930s excavations, like hundreds of skulls from Gaza that are boxed, and I'm not able to access them obviously, but I asked them to send photos over building trust over many months, and finally I like received this document of images of different parts of skulls from 100 different bodies. And so like, is that an archive? You know, what do we do with it once we have the images? And we're trying to figure out now, like, what do we do with these images of of bodily remains that are in boxes in storage at Cambridge University in the Duckworth lab, and they're labeled and numbered and so on. And we're going to try to figure out how to give them like a burial with dignity, for example, in the installation in the Palestinian Museum garden. So maybe like 3D printing them and then giving them a proper burial. So that's one example of the use of archives. And then a different weird one was also during my fellowship at the Victoria and Albert Museum, where a big part of my interest in doing the fellowship was trying to figure out how the glass vessels arrived to the V&A. How were they acquired, who acquired them and why, and who donated them and who gifted them. And after like the first 2 months, I got so bored of finding the same answer over and over again. the correspondence letters, acquisition documentation was just like the same thing. It's just like a British general that went to Palestine, like bought some stuff, came back and like put it in his house, and his house became a museum. And he was, it was just like that's not interesting, really. It's like so repetitive. It's hundreds of things that are always so you kind of there are dead ends sometimes where you're just like the amount of violence that exists in the archives is just like almost is numbing at the end because it's so repetitive, and so archives stop working in that way. But then they could be really inspiring, where we can kind of like restitch our relationship to each other as a collective in Palestine, and like remember that our ancestors were the ones that were doing the excavation and how amazing these women were. And you can build an entire new narrative around that, the same way that Nishat and Shahana do in their work. So, yeah.
Huda, Palin, feel free to respond.
Yes, actually, we're thinking with Huda. Firstly, thank you very much for this answer. It's kind of entangled into a really triple kind of a thinking between Dima and Shahana and Nishat. And it's really interesting to hear about about archives and de-archiving. We would like to give open to or um, attendees to public who wants to ask question or give or comment or so we are asking to our participant if they are hearing us, if they want to pick up the microphone and say something or ask question.
While we're waiting, I'm just going to say to Shahana, you should really speak to Ishita, who's working across the border from you in India.
That's so
I should
crazy.
introduce it to you.
Mhm. The shrine, the one mural that I showed at the beginning, the shrine, it's the saint called Nana Savlo, and his original grave, the story is actually lies in Seer Creek, where the India-Pakistan border has formed this like no man's land where no one has access, and so fisher folk on both sides have created this like a replacement shrine that doesn't actually have his grave. And yeah, you really feel in the Delta how much the border is really present across communities.
I just have one other um, question or topic about alternative pedagogies, because I know that our speakers are also teaching, they are teachers. And as an architect, although they are very much coming, I mean, having a transdisciplinary research and practice, how they see, I mean, how to go back to architectural education and how your practice informs and challenge your pedagogy. I know Dima is teaching now a very urgent studio. Shahana has this alternative pedagogical practices, and Nishat is using a different kind of the urban lab on UCL. How your practice informs or challenges, what kind of also challenges, also difficulties, you have in intervening, proceeding, practicing your own pedagogical task in your institutions and non-institutions.
I've been running this studio at the RCA in the city design program called Underground Palestine. Each year we do a different case study, a different site. This is the 5th year, and last year we focused on Gaza, which was really difficult to do. The students usually come from very different backgrounds. We have students from all over the world that come partially from an architecture degree. Others come from policy and photography. So very, very diverse group of students, which is amazing. And some of them come in knowing about the history of Palestine, and others completely have no idea where even that is on the map. So there's this kind of a really difficult teaching moment at the beginning. How do you talk about Palestine in relation to city design. Why is Palestine an important case study today? It's the most challenging urban context in the world. It relates to the world in so many ways. There are systems of violence at play there that are repetitive everywhere. And then term 2 is really very focused on making. I believe very deeply in making as a methodology and thinking through making. And there's something that's really inspiring that happens, I think, in the second term where through making, I think students start to understand their relationship to space in a very different way. And they are able to kind of redefine what city design means beyond the idea of the master plan, but really focusing in on multiple types of scales in relation to the city. And when it comes to Gaza, and we always have the kind of larger umbrella as cultural heritage as a focus for the studio. When it comes to Gaza, I think the real trick was the previous case studies were very rigorous. They were very particularly focused on particular sites, an archaeological site here or a neighborhood in Sheikh Jarrah where dispossession is happening. But the scale of destruction in Gaza was so gigantic that the only thing that was left to do was, we couldn't do like site analysis where you can really identify like what's happened. And it's just way too big. And so this was a real issue that we had last year. And as a response, actually, as a kind of an intuitive response, as a teaching method, we went to speculative work almost entirely from the beginning, which is very unusual. So the beginning, usually the first entire term, we focus on kind of creating a forensic evidence-based structure that we can build on later on. But in Gaza, it was very difficult to do that because the scale was so different. So it led me to this year, the theme of the studio is actually dreams and building cosmograms, which relates to some of the things that we've been talking about today. And it's interesting talking to some of my friends in Gaza that to them, the sky is the only space that they can dream from. It's their only escape is the sky, not even the sea, because there's a lot of violence on the coast. So there's something there, I think, in the verticality that I find really important.
Thanks for sharing that, Dima. I've been following the program that you've built and even the recent course. It just sounded really incredible. And I'm just hearing you, I can't even imagine the challenges that also come with creating this kind of a pedagogical course in an institutional setting. And just, yeah, I think
We were
it
very
sounds.
lucky to have the right people supporting us. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like with Karachi La Jamia in Nyanzara, we took a really kind of the different approach of in that moment we were just so disillusioned from the university space and from the kinds of censorship that we were experiencing that it felt like to create a space, an open space where we could continue to do the work and the research and ask the questions that we wanted to. The most conducive space for that would be to step outside the campus. But of course, we continue to teach, and so it's not really a retreat from the university, but I guess this is a different strategy where then we started using public spaces in the city as spaces where we would gather and ask each course gets structured around this kind of collective question or is in collaboration with an ongoing struggle or environmental movement in the city. And I think in the process of doing that work, something that we've also two things that we've thought the work has forced us actually to think a lot about, especially in relation to the work that we do in our institutional teaching kind of phases, is thinking both about questions of scale, firstly. So around the time that we started Karachi La Jamia was also a time when there was so much funding flowing into Karachi, again, post 9/11, public art festivals, and there was this real feeling or need or impulse to do things really big and to create really large scale, spectacular, thousands of people attending. And I think one thing we had decided really early on is to ensure the group safety and to be able to kind of do the work we wanted while going undetected. It had to be few people and it had to be small scale, and to really kind of unlearn that kind of that demand of like, or this idea of you have to reach many people to do meaningful work, and that no, if even if it's a group of 5 people who come together, that's creating that space and doing that work is also equally important. And then the other thing we've been thinking about and practicing a lot, and I guess have had the opportunity to do because it's outside the institution and there it's not a degree oriented thing, is also just to think about, to really kind of do away with the idea of output, where when we gather and commit to do research together around a course, a site, with a movement, with an activist group, there is no output, and the research is the process, and the research is building relationships and building alliances, witnessing together, seeing together. And I feel like that's also, it's been interesting to see how that shifts things sometimes, or allows for these really slow research processes that really unfold over years and years, and then to see, a few years later, maybe one of the participants going on to do their PhD research on this topic, or someone writing an article, or something, of course, always emerges. And me and Zara have done work around these collaborative research projects as well. But there's something about thinking specifically about kind of the pedagogy that we've been experimenting with, where study really becomes the relationship and the friendships and the time that is spent together and the community that gets formed around. And there's something really beautiful that also happens in that process.
Just say something short. I tend to move in and out of teaching and institutional teaching, particularly in architecture, because it is problematic, as you both sort of alluded to, especially Shahana. And somehow in the UK as well, architectural teaching is split between the kind of professional courses and the non-professional courses, which creates very unequal relationships actually between the kinds of work that all of us are doing and then, the people who are doing actual architecture. And so that obviously annoys me. And so I pull out and then come back again. And so, I don't know. Teaching within institutions is really difficult, which is why I guess we all do that kind of work outside. So I was speaking about larger than the visiting schools. That's an organization run by Zara Sen. So I collaborate with her a lot to do the kind of work that you're also speaking about, Shahana, which is outside of an institution, but still creates that kind of space in a particular place for kind of learning and doing things together. So much more nourishing. But I also feel like we shouldn't leave the institution, and we need to do that work there too. So yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think we're going to wrap up. I know we've already kind of gone over a little bit our anticipated endpoint, but of course, want to thank all of you on behalf of the committee. Palin, Huda, thank you for articulating our intention so well. And we put, I think, a lot of thought and care into this question. How can we build relation? We really want to center it for all the publics that the CCA reaches. And Nishat, Shahana, Dima, each of you really extended it in really, I think, important and meaningful ways. And I think what stood out to me actually is this very kind of, I don't know a better term, but kind of hospitable methods you all have been building over many, many years, actually. And you really kind of You invited us in with a lot of courage and graciousness to think with all of you across these multi-year complex, like really deeply thought projects. So thank you for that. I think this is the space where we are trying to kind of talk about methods, talk about this research process. And of course, when it touches on questions of survival, endurance, liberation across many, many different communities, it's hard work, as Palin put it. And we're really grateful to all of you for sharing it with us. And as I said at the outset, in some ways, you're kind of role models for us and the wider CCA community around the Architecture's Public Concern Fellowship. So these are the kind of projects we're inviting, exactly these kind of hospitable, careful, and really rigorous projects with communities and with centering this question of how we can build relation. So thank you for that. And if you have, the kind of specificity of the fellowship is that it's open to CCA Research Network members. So these are alumni who have come through a program, but we very much welcome collaborative proposals. So this is where we're trying to make it a little more porous to many, many different researchers from all over the world. So the deadline for that is December 15th. So please do share it. We got one question in Q&A that I just wanted to note, and I think Isadora, the coordinator of research here at CCA, has encouraged the person to send along their request to our email address, and maybe we can gather some references from all of you and share those afterwards. So with that, I did also want to note that the CCA Research Network newsletter that goes out to members will soon, as we had this fantastic event with Huda at the RCA last week in London that gathered alumni from around London area to share work in progress around these guiding questions of the network. We will host, as Giovanna mentioned, another event in New Haven at Yale University at the end of January, similarly for, let's say, New York area alumni, specifically around this question of how we can build relation. So that will go out very soon as a call. And there will be other events to come. Actually, some we're going to change format, where we'll be, thinking carefully and very much in situ with certain researchers at other locations around the world, where it won't so much necessarily be sharing work in progress, but it'll be about really thinking within a research project on site. So you can also wait to hear more about that soon. So thanks to all of you, really. It feels like now, thankfully, the kind of exception to be in these online spaces, but there are these benefits, which I think we all experienced over the past couple of hours. So it was really, really inspiring and meaningful, and we're incredibly grateful, on behalf of the whole committee and the CCA. Thank you. And thank you, of course, Isadora, who's the CCA Research Coordinator, who's helping to manage our event, as well as our public team and our digital communications team for helping to gather us and disseminate all of your incredible projects. So with that, we will close. This was really, truly inspiring, and we will stay in touch. That's the important thing.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Bye.